Hey guys, welcome out to Revolution this morning. We're going to continue our study of the Johannine comma, and I'm trying to make videos that just deal with the Johannine comma and then just one particular topic, like say origin or what Elijah Hickson says, or in this case we're looking at the Johannine comma and Scrivener. So Frederick Henry Ambrose Scrivener, and so he is the author of the Textus Receptus. I shouldn't say author. He is the compiler of the Textus Receptus that's usually used by most scholars nowadays, and it's part of what the Trinitarian Bible Society publish. And so I have that in many formats. Like say this is Jay Green's Interlinear. He uses the Strong's numbers above Scrivener's text. I've got the earlier Jay Green edition where he does that with the TR of Scrivener and the Hebrew. Um, and I've got the little blue TR around somewhere around here, and that's printed by the Trinitarian Bible Society. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through, but the main thing I wanted to talk about was the comma Johannium and how Scrivener dealt with that, because it seems, I guess, in a way, there is quite a bit of confusion with some people think that Scrivener is a TR guy. And this is one of the things, sorry about that. This is one of the things that critical text guys seem to parrot quite a lot. Listening to a lot of D.A. Waite's material, they sort of knew that Scrivener was a text critic, but that was sort of like, well, he does favour the TR sort of thing. And so, but as they went along through the years, they were like, well, actually, reading Scrivener's material, it's pretty bad. There's a lot of things in there just saying delete this verse, throw this verse out. So not as bad as Westcott and Hort, but still bad. And so I call him like critical text light. He was on the committee with Westcott and Hort, and so I think to actually do that, you have to be deeply compromised to do that anyway. Considering also they had Unitarians working on the text as well, so he's there with Unitarian. It's like being in a room with Jehovah's Witnesses and trying to work out what the Bible says, and trying to usurp the King James and Textus Receptus. And so I'm just going to start reading through this, and as I go through, I think a little bit of light will come to the whole situation with Scrivener, because it's some people really revere Scrivener as like a TR defender, and some people realize that he's not. And I think we don't want to be ignorant about these things. Now, for many years, I've basically, even on my website, if you jump onto tr.org.au, tr.org.au, I just made it, I've got a domain with a few little letters just so people can remember it. So textusreceptus.com with a hyphen. But if we go to any verse, and so one of my main verses I go to, just because I had to have like a template type of verse to copy, for other verses to sort of match up to. So Matthew chapter 1, if we go through that, we can see, just by the way I've set up my site, I don't have the text of Scrivener up the top. I have the text of Theodore Beza. Now, why have I done that? It's because that is the text that the King James translators followed. Now, what happened when the King James translators did their text? They moved away from the text of Beza in about 20 translatable places. And so I document that in an article, the 191 deviations. And so 190 variations in Scrivener's 1881 Greek New Testament from Beza's 1598 Textus Receptus. So if you go through that, I haven't completed everything there, but there's enough there to show you why I believe this concept. So at the end of Scrivener's TR, he used to have, a preface, and people make much ado about the preface, and people are like, oh, if only they kept the preface in, and usually it's someone like Mark Ward, and unfortunately, when you watch Mark Ward's material, you just end up having to sort of clarify some things that they're just the dumbest things ever, but it's like you sort of have to go over them because people just go, Mark Ward, he knows what he's talking about. And so basically, Mark Ward is sort of like down on the Textus Receptus because it doesn't have the original preface in it. The original TR that Scrivener did, basically in the preface, and I should get my little blue one here. I wish that I had that now, because it does have the Trinitarian Bible Society one that's from 1976, and so basically in that they have a two-page preface, and they basically describe that it's basically the text of Beza, and so there's Scrivener said there was 190 differences between his Greek text and the text of Beza when he examined the King James. Okay, so basically you've got the text of Theodore Beza. It's used by the King James translators. They deviated from that in about 20 places, 20 translatable places. But there's a few little nicks and things in the Greek that can make a name be Ozios or Hosios, but they're not translatable because it's going to be, the name is going to be how it is in English because that's how English names are. Like say Beelzebub, that the Greek says Beelzebul, and that's one of his changes. It's like it should be Beelzebul, but he only does it in one place. There's other places he leaves it as Beelzebub. It's like, okay. And so you got the text of Beza. It's used by the King James translators. Now, had they amended those, 20 or so places that are translatable and the other ones that aren't translatable, the small, tiny little breathing marks and things like that, and sometimes there's sometimes in this list it's redundant, like a 190 list. Sometimes it's just a chi, which is our and when you read it, it's like, well, the English needed an and there, or else it wouldn't have made sense. And he's making out that it's an addition. And so I've been going through this list for quite a while. And so what's happened, Scrivener's basically just copied the whole text of Theodore Beza and just amended it in 191 places, and then it becomes his own text. And these 191 places aren't big at all. They're very, very, very small. And I don't think he did that to go, this is my own text. He did that to show where the Greek text of Westcott and Hort deviates from the Greek text of the authorized version. And so what in Scrivener's first original edition, he's got the Greek text there, and it's not just dealing with these type of issues, like, editions of the TR and things like that. It's actually got a whole section in it that shows where there's deviations from the critical text. So that's why, Mark Ward's like, why doesn't he have the preface? Why doesn't he have it? Why don't the King James translators, read their preface to the 1611? It's just like, it just does my head in. This guy's just like, he's smarter than that, and he just acts really stupid, and he just pretends that we just don't have a clue. So basically, he's saying, we never read the King James Version preface. I've written the whole entire commentaries on it. Um, but when it comes to Scriveners, we don't need that preface in there with the Trinitarian Bible Society edition because it doesn't have all the critical text notes. It doesn't have all the deviations of, the Common Johannine totally taken out and things like that and footnotes to do with that. And it's like, what the Trinitarian Bible Society have done, they've basically gotten the Greek text and gone, okay, well, this is just sort of like 99.99999% of, I did a James White there, 99.99% of Theodore Beza, and then he's just he's just tweaked a few tiny little crumbs here and there, and it's all of a sudden it's Scrivener's. And people are like, oh, just focus on the Scrivener text. Really, if we just were printing Beza's, and Beza's was printed up until this time. But what people realized was that if the King James translators just printed a parallel Greek text with their English edition, none of this would be an issue. But the thing was, Scrivener basically did that in 1881 because it didn't get done. But they didn't really feel it needed to be done, or I guess they weren't really commissioned to do that. But they created their own Textus Receptus. The underlying text of the King James is the TR that I say is the TR that matches the originals and the Masoretic text as well. And so if I go back to Beza, I can see the vast majority of the time they're just following Beza, but there are a few little bits here and there. Like I said, 20 translatable differences where they do deviate toward a different reading. And so they created their own TR. So basically you've got the text of Erasmus and text of Scrivener. Text of Erasmus, text of Stephanus, don't want to confuse it. Text of Beza, and then you got the King James guys, and they created their own text, but they just never printed it. It was basically the underlying text that they use, and they had their own text because you could tell by what readings they have in the King James. And if you think that sounds weird, well, that's exactly what Westcott and Hort thought as well, and Scrivener, because they were like, okay, let's get the Greek text and we'll show where it differs. And they were like, well, it never really got done in 1611. We kept printing the text of Beza, and the Elzevirs doesn't match up exactly to the King James. It's good, but it's like, there's a few crumbs of things around that it's not exactly. And so Scrivener went, he was commissioned to do this, and he said, okay, well, I'll get the text of Beza and I'll go through it, and when I'll read through the 1611, and wherever there's a deviation, I'll amend the Greek to match the English, so that way it'll be the exact text that the King James would have used. And so basically, we're using that text sort of like, well, the text has been in the King James all along. That hasn't changed. But what we're doing is we're basically just going from the text of Theodore Beza, which had these 20 little, different readings. And the thing is, if you go through Beza's original text with his annotations and all the rest of it, I'm pretty sure absolutely every one of these readings is documented in his annotations or in marginal notes, because he talks about every type of deviation from different readings and things like that. And so, so at the end of the day, Mark Ward saying we need the the preface to this. We don't. That's ridiculous. If you want to know the history of it, that's fine. You can just find it online. Why do you need it printed in this? Why do the Trinitarian Bible Society have to do this? It's like James White. Why don't they have a whole bunch of footnotes at the bottom? Why don't they show us the variant readings? They're hiding something. It's like, because we don't want that. Because we believe that what's there is basically the Word of God. Now, I think Scrivener did a pretty good job. I take my hat off to him and say, good on you, Scrivener. Did he make mistakes? Yes, and I document that here. And I've also started a page of just the 1881 and the 1598 compared. and so it just goes through like, this is one that Mark Ward goes on about, Matthew 2:11, euron or edon, and basically they both mean the same thing, to see. One is sort of like I found it, and the other one's I saw it, and so it's not really a big deal. So I've got a whole article on that there, and how the Latin didn't change because they saw it as a synonym, and so I've got quite a bit written about that. And I mean, how long ago did I write that? We're looking at probably 10 years ago. So at least for 10 years. Okay, so we'll go through the history, edit history. We'll go down to the first Greek Textus Receptus. Okay, so with 2011. Commentary. 2021 commentary. Okay, so it's actually harder to find that than I thought it would be. But I'll just go down to here. Oh yeah, so it's where the commentary is. Well, so basically, actually, it's probably just easier just going on to this page here and just looking at the history, because this is how long I've been examining the differences between Scrivener and Beza. So when they're like, which TR, so I've known the difference between Scrivener and Beza for at least, I'll go to last. Current or last? Or is last most recent? I think it is. Okay, how do you go to earlier? Sorry about this, guys. I should have, once you start fiddling around with this sort of thing. Okay, so go to the 500. And doesn't seem to show any more than that. That's it. A little bit weird. Anyway, I'd say it's about 10 years, at least, that I've been putting up stuff about the differences between Scrivener and the other texts. When you look at what Scrivener had at the end of his TR, he had this list. And so basically it's like he compares the Complutensian polyglot, the Antwerp polyglot, Erasmus's editions, Beza's editions, Aldus's edition, the Vulgate, Collinnaeus, Tyndale's English, Stephanus, and the Authorized Version. So he goes through all of them, and he mentions a few others every now and then, like the Clementine here. And so he's going through all of that, and so the thing is, people like Mark Ward are like, oh, people don't realize that there's variations in the Textus Receptus. Calls them texti recepti. And it's like, I mean, even like this one shows that he's gone through like all these and he's showing where there's differences, just with between Beza's 1598 and the 1611. So this is what his lists contain. So he's got the 190 there. Like I said, I only think about 20 are translatable, and I'll sort of prove that in a second. But this shows clearly that TR people, they know about different editions of the Textus Receptus. In the Bluebound book, which I wish I had here now, there's only 2 pages in English at the beginning of it. And I think it's something like 30, was it? I think 20, 22 or something. Anyway, I'm just pulling a number out of the air there. But there's over 20 TR editions mentioned. It talks about the 5 editions of Erasmus, talks about Stephanus, talks about the Elzevirs, talks about all these TR editions. And then it says, basically this is the 1598 with a few crumbs of changes. So it's exactly the same as 1598, a few little crumbs of changes to match the King James. And so if you were a TR person you would simply just, get your blue bound TR and look at that and go, read through it and go, oh, there's other editions of the TR. And this is what does my head in. People who are on the critical text side, they're coming out and saying, we were never told there were other editions of the TR. We were told the blue bound one is it. That's what Stephen Boyce said. And I'm just like, huh? Like, and I just read the preface. It's like, and it's mentions all of these types of things, like Beza's 5 editions and Erasmus's, and it's like, didn't you ever read the preface? The only thing in English there, and they're walking around their college campuses with these blue things like, this is it, this is the Bible, this is it, and then it's like they've never read. It just shows you how, yeah, it's like saying, Star Wars is a gardening program, and they're walking around with Star Wars, DVDs. Like, yeah, I'm into it. I am so into it. Look at me, I'm full on, and it's like, it's it's all about a gardening. It's all about gardening. It's like, no, it's not. Have you ever watched it? You ever looked at it? Have you ever opened it up and read it? It's like, how dumb can this generation be? I mean, that's one thing that I was sort of pointing towards. It's like when Mark Ward basically says that no TR person knows there's you know, other editions of the TR, and it's sort of like, man, who are these people? It only seems like a bunch of critical text guys that come out and said, "Hey, I used to be King James only," and seriously, they would have to be the dumbest King James only, even King James only people. Like if I was to contact someone like Sam Gibb, say, "Hey Sam, I know we have a few disagreements on a few things, and you're, sort of like Ruckmanite, and I'm, TR sort of base and all that. But do you know there's other different editions of the TR?" You just go, uh, yeah. It's like saying, did you know that there were other presidents but besides President Trump? People are like, what? I thought Trump was like eternal. I thought, it's so dumb. It's the dumbest thing. And it's so dumb that I just, I've spent a lot of time just pondering and thinking about it. And I just still end up with that Tucker Carlson look on my face like, how, how, how are they even talking about, the which TR edition? Now, I understand there are some people who they're hard to nail down. But at the end of the day, someone like Jeff Riddle, he's just like, okay, we follow the TR of the Reformation. Um, it's in there. Where I'm more specific, like, okay, it's the underlying text of the King James. But these guys are sort of like, okay, it's in, it's in the text of Beza, but there's a few other readings from other ones like these editions here. And that's actually fine because that's what Scrivener thought, and that's probably what the King James translators did. So basically, we're sort of in agreement, but they're just explaining it in a different way. At the end of the day, and I was thinking about this yesterday, could the anti-King James movement actually be a woke type of movement that just hates white people? English colonialists. I mean, who was the biggest colonialist group around? The British. The Raj in British India, Rhodesia, and just a whole bunch of horrible things that the British did, and a whole bunch of good things that they did as well, because it's just part and parcel with doing things. You do good and bad, but a lot of what they did was rape and pillage. And basically, after they defeated the Nazis, they were like, "Well, we know we've been like the Nazis for the last, 300 years. We better sort of slow back down on that." And so people aren't favouring those types of people anymore. So they pretended to, you pull back on that, and they just kept all the mines. And anyway, I won't get into politics. But could it be just a woke thing where people are, because people just have this automatic bias against English. I mean, if you say it's in the Greek Septuagint, they fawn and faint and go, oh, like they're falling in love. You say it's in a Targum or the Ugaritic, or it's in, you know, it's some other, it's a Vulgate reading. Oh, that's so good. But when you say it's in the English, they're like, what? In the English, and it's like they're offended by that. That the Word of God could be in English, and the Word of God could be accurately represented in English, and also carried across. Because Beezer did his thing, and then the English one was the one that tidied up. It's like the final edition of Beezer sort of thing. When Beezer's passed away, they're like, okay, we're going to add this tiny little bit here, 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 and here. Where Beezer sort of, he got so far, and then it's like they just did 20 little changes, and it's like just the sprinkles. The guy who does the salt thing down there, they just went on the text, finished. It's like voila, done, but it was in English. It's very smart that they did this too, because I think the whole concept of like the Orthodox Church and their Greek text, or the Roman Church and their Latin text, it's like, well, we're the English Church. We got an English text. Even though they were brilliant Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic scholars, they were like, okay, well, we've got an underlying text, but we're not going to focus on it. It's in English now. That's it. That's all the King commissioned to do. He didn't tell us to do a parallel, but later on, Scrivener said, okay, I'm going to do a parallel. So anyway, I'm going to move on from here and talk about the comma, but I just I'd explain that. But just before I do, we look at Matthew chapter 1, verse 8 and 9. So we're looking at Ozian versus Ozios, or no, sorry, Ozian and Ozios, or Hosian and Hosios. So it's basically just a smooth breathing or a rough breathing. So we're looking at, I'll just go back here. So what I've done is what's written there, I've examined and put it into an article here. So Matthew 1:8, Ozion. The 1598 says Hosion. So I might zoom that in so you can actually see the difference, because it's pretty hard to see. Okay, I'll be a bit overboard there. So we have the smooth breathing and the rough breathing. That's the differences we're talking about. And so I've taken a snapshot of Scrivener's there. This is Scrivener's original text, where he has Ozion and Hosios, and he has a star there that points to this thing at the back, the index at the back with the 191 differences. But see how that's capitalized? That's in bold and Asa, because then down the bottom it says Asaph, and the Westcott and Hort text says As. So it's like the New King James footnote sort of thing. It's like we don't want that in our TR text. That's why the Trinitarian Bible Society don't just print what Scrivener did. They amended it and changed it and go, okay, well, the text is actually closer to the authorized version than what Beezer did. Yeah, even though Beezer's is right up there, it's just that sprinkle of salt on top. So okay, and we're going to use that, but we're just going to cut out all the references to Westcott and Hort and all the rest of it. And so when Mark Ward's making such a big deal about we need this preface, it's like, what are you talking about, dude? You're just trying to find anything to come again. He has a deep-seated hatred towards the TR because he sold his soul for cash. He is Lexham Press, like I work for, Logos, and he is just, he's so toxic. When I listen to his videos, he is just like, you King James guys are all basically illiterate bozos, and I'm a scholar, and my friends are all like the smartest guys I know, and I've learned so much from them. I've never learned anything from you guys because you guys are just dimwits. And why don't you just start reading the modern Bibles? And why aren't you my friend? And like you're so bombastic, and it's just like and he's all over the place. He'll be really kind to you one minute, and the next minute he's just calling you an absolute loser who can't even use a dictionary. And apparently he's done more to further the reading of the King James Version than anyone on the planet. When I listen to the guy, it's like, is this guy for real? It's like listening to Joe Biden. Like, seriously, that's how I actually get more hilarity out of Mark, because Joe Biden, I just feel sorry for the guy. He's just like, you know, he's got Obama speaking in his earpiece and all the rest of it, and he's like, I'm just trying to repeat it and trying to be funny. But Mark Ward, this is coming from Mark Ward. He's young. He knows what he's saying. He's not he's not illiterate. He's not a dimwit, and it's like and he's saying these things. So anyway. Then I've got a photo of Beza's text with the Aussie on reading there, and then I've got what the King James says. So it's Aussios. So, and then down the bottom I've got the explanation of why. And then Matthew, so that's one. Then Matthew 1:9, it's the same issue, but it's just in a different verse. Okay, so so when we go through Matthew, so we're looking at the difference between kalesis or kalasusi. So kalasusi is in like they shall call, or kalesis is shall be called, but it can be in the singular, but it can also be pluralized, and that's one of the things I do quite a lot on this verse. Go through Beza's notes, go through what Scrivener said. So yeah, I've got quite a lot in that, and basically my conclusion is it was translated correctly, and Beza didn't really need to change it. So they shall call, with a marginal note, or thou, so it can be singular. The context makes it plural. So then Matthew 2:11, we went through that. So I've got quite a big article on that. Matthew 2:17, what are we looking at? Jeremiah. So Jeremiah. So it's Jeremiah or Jeremiah. How would a smooth breathing or rough breathing be with the iota? It's like Jeremiah or Jeremiah. That's the difference. So it's not translated. It's going to be Jeremiah no matter what. So Matthew 3:3. When we look at the change, yeah, just smooth breathing, rough breathing again. And so it was always going to be translated as Isaiah or Isaias, or it's not going to be Hasias. Having the ice there after the archon, so it's talking about the certain ruler. And so when I look through the English, it's like, okay, there came a certain ruler, 1526, certain ruler, all the way down to 1611. It's the same reading. But these Greek texts actually did change over time. And so they weren't following ice here when it says a certain ruler. So why does the King James have to have it? So Scrivener, I believe he made a mistake there by putting it in there. So yeah, got a fair bit of information there. Then we go from Matthew 10:10. Rabdos is Scrivener's reading because it's plural in the King James with staffs or staves, but it's actually rabdon, which becomes plural in the context because he's saying don't bring a staff, but he's talking to a group of people. So it's like don't bring your phone. Okay, they're all not going to bring their phone, so that's phones. So it just sort of shows sometimes too that Scrivener didn't know the Greek that well, or yeah, that he made a few errors. Beelzebub, he's changed it to Beelzebub, but it's actually Beelzebul. But one of the rules of the translators is to the names of the prophets and the holy writers with the other names of the text to be retained as nigh as may be, according to as they are vulgarly used. So in England, if they're using the word Beelzebub, just use that. Don't say Beelzebul and like, oh, what's that? It's like, oh, that's the Greek, how the Greeks say it. It's like, don't call Paul Paulos. Call him Paul. You know what I mean? And so that's one of the issues there. But there are 6 passages that read Beelzebul in the underlying Greek text of Beza, and it's translated Beelzebub by the King James translators, and it shows it. Beelzebub appears in Scrivener's text only in Matthew 10:25, but in the other places it follows Beelzebul. So that's what I can't understand why Scrivener just changed it in that one spot. And see, this is the problem. Sometimes Scrivener actually changed these things to follow and to sort of justify the reading of Westcott Hort because he was working on their committee. So that's where I'm going into that as well, and examining the influence Westcott and Hort had on Scrivener with some of these readings. And so, but at the end of the day, if I'm holding, that's why I say, look, Scrivener did a good job, and there's only a few little places here and there that, read like that. But at the end of the day, it's like I would say it's the closest one to the King James. But I still go with the King James. I say it's the underlying Greek text that probably got destroyed in the Great Fire of London in 1666. There was a huge fire, 437 acres burnt in London. They used to have a museum with all the King James material in it, and that just burned up, and so it's gone. And so we find scraps here and there, and we find, the writings of, Boyce, and we've got sermons here and there talking about little bits and pieces. But at the end of the day, it's like that Greek text is gone. So the English was just left. That's why the King James became so important, because it's sort of like, okay, we've recompiled the Greek, and then it's like we've done this English translation of it, and then the Greek's gone up in smoke. But we still have the text of Beza. We can still work on that and reconstruct it, but it's sort of like, well, what's the point? We know what it says in English. Scrivener's done his job here. There's a few little tweaks. Um, like everything so far that I've read hasn't needed to be said. Matthew 11:21, Bethsaida or Bethsaiden. It's going to be Bethsaida in 1611. Um, uh, Scrivener and Beza, it's basically the final nu that makes a difference. Okay, so then we got, I think it's another Beelzebub issue. So I don't rehash those. Speranti or Speranti. Um, and so basically this is like, when you look, that so, which sowed, which sowed, which sowed, which sowed, in all the Wycliffe, Tyndale, Matthews, Geneva bishops, King James has which sowed. So it doesn't really matter if you've got Speranti or Speranti. It matters in the Greek sense. But anyway, so I'll go into all that. I don't want to explain every single one of these, but I just want to let you know that when you go through all of these, at the end of the day, like some things aren't even translated, like this one here. Um, and that's it. That's Matthew. So if I was to go through all that was said about Matthew in here, and people are like, oh, why don't they have these notes? What, James White and Mark, well, why don't they have these? They're deceptive. Why don't? It's because none of these are really relevant. I'll debate anyone on any one of these. On Rabdos being changed to, or Rabdon being changed to Rabdos. It's unnecessary. Now, is it a wrong reading? For a modern Greek person, no, that's fine to have Rabdos because it's plural. In the King James, it's plural. But it becomes plural because of the context. Rabdon is perfectly fine, so it's not a mistranslation. They basically mean exactly the same thing in the context. And so, um, anyway, I thought I'd show you all those things, just because Mark Ward has made much ado about Scrivener. There he is there, old Scriv, and Mark Ward has his video. Is the Textus Receptus perfect in every jot and tittle? And so he uses a lot of if I was to go through and just base what I say on the ignorance of critical text people, I could go a long way. I mean, but, some people are critical text people and they don't know anything. But it seems like these guys just go for the lowest hanging fruit of, find people who don't know something and then just focus on them. And it's like, no, all TR people, King James people, they're usually focusing on what James White says, Dan Wallace says, Elijah Hickson, Peter Curry, and Mark Ward's elevating himself to the guru status. And so we're like, okay, we'll quote what he's saying. I'm not just quoting someone who following Mark Ward who doesn't know anything and saying, look, these critical text people think this, what idiots. But these guys do that. They'll just see a tweet and go, I can't believe that these people believe that. It's just dishonest. I would challenge Mark Ward to go through my website to see if I've got the wrong view of Scrivener, and to see now when you first become a Christian, you're ignorant of everything. But then after a while, you start learning things, and especially when I moved to a Textus Receptus position and then eventually, King James position, understanding that they're basically both the same thing. Um, Say, 15 years ago, I started to think, Scrivener's not correct here. And I started to say that, got a little bit of pushback, but then it was like, it was sort of like becoming a scholarly standard that people understood that. Now, there might be ignorant people there, and say, Stephen Boyce is like, we thought that the Blue Bound book was it. Scrivener's was absolutely 100% the word of God. It's all correct. And it's like, it's almost that, but it's just a tiny little bit more complicated than that. But really, Scrivener's is the closest to the authorized version. It's the closest underlying text that we have in print at the moment to the authorized version. And so it's pretty true. You know what I mean? But these guys are using certain standards. What they'll do is they'll say the King James onlyist demand perfection, and then they'll go to someone like Jeff Riddle who doesn't say he's a King James onlyist, but they'll label him as such, and so then they can use this other King James only argument to try and demonize Jeff Riddle and say, well, you King James only guys believe this and that. And he's like, well, I'm not a King James only. Anyway, so I think you've got the point there. So let's look at the Johannine comment and Scrivener. Now I'm just going to see if there's any chat. Stephen Hay says the most annoying thing of all is when James White categorizes Scrivener's TR as a back translation of the King James version. Yeah, and see that's the thing of those of that list that I've got there of 190. Like I said, like in Matthew, I can't find one thing in Matthew that's even worthy of mention. Then I go through and I find one thing in Mark, and then I go find through another thing in Luke, and it's just when I count through it, it's sort of like about 10% of the 190. So that's where I get about the 20 number, 19 or 20. And also I've got the list. Kurt DeVitro gave me his list, and so going through that and just checking that as well. But and also Peter Hasey, he's done quite a fair bit on this. I don't agree with all of his scholarship because sometimes I've found errors in that, but sometimes he's just stating the obvious, and it's very good. And I'll put a nice picture of Scrivener there while we chat about James White. And so the whole thing about a back translation, they're trying to make out the whole thing was back translated. Like we've got the King James, and it's just like, what do we do? Okay, let's just copy, the book of the generation of Jesus Christ. What's that in Greek? Okay, let's just write it in Greek. Like they're just starting from scratch. It's like, no, they've already got 99.99999% of it in Beezer. And like I said about that guy on the cooking show who just puts that little bit of salt down on the meat, it's like that's all Scrivener did. He was just like, oh, okay, well, there's 190 things that look like this in the Greek. There's probably about 30 of them that are just rubbish, that he's just sort of in his own mind, and because he's a bit polluted as a text critic, he's trying to favour sort of Westcott and Horde, he's sort of got a bit blurred, and so that could cut it down to say 160 issues. Maybe there's that many in the Greek, but when it's like I said, it's mostly to do with breathing marks, and so of how things are pronounced, the pronunciation of the. It's not saying it's a different town. It's not, not like the critical text where it's like, yeah, Jesus is going to the wrong place, or the swine marathon where they go 30 kilometers down the road. It's like, no, it's still the same word. It's just we're debating about, you know, the little jots and tittles on there. And so um, to say it's a back translation, no, it's if James White was to be honest, and if people following him and parroting that were to be honest, they would say, no, it's the text. It's the 1598 text of Theodore Beza, and with approximately 20 um, variations that the King James translators worked on. And see, that's the thing. It's almost like, okay, Erasmus is there, Stephanus is there, Theodore Beza is there, and they're all on the Greek side. These learned guys, they're over there. They're studying the Greek and doing the manuscript stuff. And then you have this different department. Oh, the translation side is over here, the King James guys, blah blah blah, and it's like they're just completely separate. But a lot of the translators knew Beza personally. They'd go to France um, and Geneva and talk with him and be with him. He was very famous, and so um, some of these people were related to Beza. So I mean, you imagine Beza's there when they announce that they're going to do an English translation. It's like wow, and a lot of the time he's dedicating his work to the Queen of England, and he's living in Geneva. So these guys were Anglophiles. They loved England. They loved the whole concept of England had become like this Protestant nation and all that. And um, so yeah, at the end of the day, um, any one of the translators could have gone over to this camp, the Greeky guys, and done their own translation. Like imagine if someone just scratched down like 20 of the readings, like say Lancelot Andrews, who just went, okay, well, apparently in the future they're going to make a huge deal about this, so we'll just try and stop that. Um, okay, so where are these 20 differences? And okay, let's change that, change that. He could do it in probably 20 minutes. We'll go and print that just to keep these guys happy in the future, keep Mark Ward and James White from, deceiving everyone in the future. Let's just do that. Imagine that'd be cool to make a movie like Time Machine or, you know, um, I remember when I was young, we used to watch the Bill and Ted thing, and it was so stupid. But it's like, yeah, you imagine you were able to go back in time and you're like trying to explain to the King James guys, like, look, I understand it sounds really stupid, but can you guys just do a Greek Bible and a Hebrew Bible to match up? It's like, they'll understand. They've got Beeza here, and we're only commissioned to do the English, and it doesn't matter that much. It's just in the Greek, and people will be able to work it out. And it's like, no, they won't. Like seriously, it's just I know it's the tiniest little crumb of an issue, but these guys have got big magnifying glasses, and they are looking at this like it's the biggest deal ever. And then they'll go and swallow Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. It's like which had massive differences between them, and then they'll say all the Bible translations are all the same. It's like okay, NIV, ESV. You start comparing them and reading them. It's like, well, how come this has this reading and NIV 2005 edition has this other reading, and then they bounce back to the TR reading, and then it's like apparently they're all the same. So just stop thinking, and if Big Brother says 1+1 = 5, you just say it. And so finally you're like, 1+1 = 5. And then it's like, no, you're wrong again. It's like, Mark Ward's like, you're wrong again. It's like, oh, what did I do? And it's like, no, 1+1 will equal, or 2+2 will equal whatever I tell you it equals. That's what they basically want to say. And where it's like, we determine, the academy determines, Big Brother will tell you. And like I was saying, I think this is actually an attack on white people. You know how we know as um, like I understand there is racism, and I probably know a fair bit about that more than people would give me credit for. I've actually stopped the KKK chapter around this area, and that was pretty big considering the next big town, a racist guy murdered 150 Muslims in New Zealand. That was pretty heavy. And so I've been to Papua New Guinea 13 times. And when I talk about racism, I'm talking about if the things that were happening up there, like say the 500,000 people who've been killed by the Indonesian government in West Papua, if that was happening to white people, there would be a huge outcry. Even we get upset when something's happening in Ukraine, Balkans, even with Russia, it's like, oh, they're white people. When they're dark skinned people, the evolutionary mindset has darkened a lot of minds, and people are concerned about white people. Other people are just sort of like animals in a lot of mindsets. Like I could talk about, say, 10 people died on a boat cruise in Australia. Isn't that tragic? And people would just be like looking into it. They'd be doing documentaries on it for the next 20 years. It would be the saddest thing ever. There'd be memorial days. That, uh, you know, 200 people died up in Papua New Guinea on a boat. Just kids going to school, capsized, and the guy was never really brought to justice and all this sort of stuff. It's just like, where? Oh, there. Oh, those people. You know what I'm saying? And so racism I believe evolution has just bred racism. And there is also, there was racism before that, and usually comes down to fear and everything. But then there's this whole other side of it, the whole woke thing, where everything is racist. And it doesn't matter what you do, how many, black friends you have, or even if you have, um, I get accused a lot of being racist because it's just like, okay, I agree with free market capitalism, so I'm a racist. I agree with basically, Ron Paul style libertarianism, so I'm apparently a Nazi. And so there's a whole bunch of things where they just label you as a Nazi and a psycho, and it's like, um, there's no interest in, you know, um, accurately representing people. And so with the whole King James thing, I was thinking, why is it that it's a hatred against English? Like, just say the Dutch had done this, or say the Germans, or say someone of that era, or just say even in Geneva. Okay, just say Geneva just went, look, we know we've done the Geneva Bible, great job, guys, but we're gonna really just we're gonna put the icing on the cake. Let's get 60 of the best translators in the world at the moment. We'll get them all over here, and we'll translate it all into Swiss or German or French or whatever, whichever language they chose, and we're gonna make it absolutely 100% perfect. We're gonna iron out every issue and all the rest of it. I would go with that one. And if I was an English speaking person and my Bible didn't match up with that type of brilliant work, I would go. Well, I need to fix my thing. Not that mine's better. You know what I mean? And this is the whole thing with Mark Ward. It's like, oh, people are just sort of King James only, King James only. And it's like, well, what's wrong with England? What's wrong with the scholarship that they had? What is Lancelot Andrews not enough? John Boyce, Henry Saville, Andrew Downs. I mean, any one of these guys could sit there and probably debate the leading scholars of textual criticism. If you had Bart Ehrman, Jan Kranz, James White, Dan Wallace, Mark Ward, all these guys, Hickson, Gurry, all these other gurus, all on a panel, and you could have someone like even just Andrew Downs, or say even someone better like Lancelot Andrews, but just say Downs, and he could just absolutely refute every single argument they had in Latin, probably. And so why aren't these guys qualified enough to make their own edition of the Greek? Why aren't they qualified enough to make an accurate translation? Is it just a bias? Is it like, or it's because later on English became known as sort of like a colonialist thing, so we've got to shut it down? It's like, no, we don't. And it's quite interesting that the King James is basically popular right up until probably the 1950s, 1960s. 70s, all these other modern Bibles start flooding in, 80s, 90s, and now it's just, in many places it's even. It's like 50% of the population reading the King James, and the other ones it's modern Bibles. But it's interesting that the whole colonialist thing and Britain, pulling back their powers and pulling back their influence. And I was thinking about it the other day, and I thought, well, I wonder if this is just a whole woke thing that that you can't if it was any other country, if it was all done in Spanish or all done in Italian or something like that, it's like, okay, that's cool. But because it's done in English, it's like, because, there's a lot of venom against America. There's a lot of venom against Britain. And it's like, could this just be a woke thing? That was a question I was asking myself the other day. I'm just going to have a look and see if there's any other comments. Scrivener back translated from the King James Version. Erasmus from the Vulgate. They all slept on banana peels and played the banjo. You KJV guys just hate scholarship. Yep, that's us. Yeah, that's the thing. It's not, Theodore Beza's text is 99.9999% of the King James. No, it's that the tiny little salt grains that went on it. So, where did you get them? It's like, oh, from the King James. You back translated. It's like, yeah, Erasmus. Oh no, he only went to the Vulgate, and it's like, well, if he only went to the Vulgate and the Communianium is in the Vulgate everywhere, in most of the manuscripts, 95%, as Scrivener's going to say, why didn't he just put the Communianium in from the Vulgate? Duh, they contradict themselves. Yeah, they all slept on banana peels and played the banjo. Yeah, the Deliverance Boy. It's interesting. It's uncanny how much that Deliverance Boy looks like Joe Biden. I mean, and I'm not joking. That's when you look at a picture of the Deliverance Boy and Joe Biden next to each other. It's like, hang on. You King James guys just hate scholarship. Yep. Every time I just hear someone just say, "Oh, let's look at the Greek or the Hebrew," I just fold up into a mass. That's the thing. It's like, say, I know hundreds of guys who are interested in talking about Greek and talking about Hebrew and talking about lots and lots of different issues. And so, yeah, Mark Ward is just fantastically lying. The Johannine comma in Scrivener. Let's get into it. Finally, Frederick Henry Ambrose Scrivener. Now, I know I'm talking about Mark Ward a lot, but has in his latest video thing, is the Textus Receptus perfect. He goes on about this guy called Henry Ambrose. But Henry Ambrose said this, and Henry Ambrose said that, and so he goes through and basically shows that the guy's not a TR guy, and then at the end goes, "I'm talking about Frederick Henry Ambrose Scrivener." It's like this big thing, and it's just sort of like, oh, okay, like we don't know that he's actually against the TR. You know what I mean? He was just commissioned to do visas and then a few crumbs of information here and there. That's it. Some of the things that he says are okay. Some of the things he says are diabolical. When I go through his the authorized version, or plain introduction is probably one of the worst, but he's also got one about the authorized version. This list just kept growing. I think it was in 1864 was his first edition. I could be wrong, but then by the time he died, I think Miller was sort of writing his stuff after he died, and because he just had so much information. The first edition has like a handful of like 20 places where he wants to amend the King James, but by the time he's passed away, it's like getting up to 50 and 60 places, and that's sort of like major places. There's other spots where it's just a word here and there, and where he wants to change those as well. No wonder he jumped on with Westcott and Hort. And you don't go just totally against your morals, okay? This guy wanted to change the words. He wanted the Communianium out. So we're going to see this. He was a 19th century textual critic who believed that the comma was not a genuine reading of Scripture. Scrivener aligned himself with Richard Pawson's position. So Richard Pawson, most of Richard Pawson's material is just sort of mockery. It's just someone who's like a raving, drunken lunatic who's just absolutely mocking you. So a bit like, the atheist crowd who are doing comedy nowadays. Just belittling. That's sort of where Richard Pawson came from. But anyway, so Scrivener said, "I would fain call it success if I could with truth. To rebut much of Pawson's insolent sophistry was easy. To maintain the genuineness of this passage is simply impossible." And so he's saying he can't believe that 1 John 5, 7 and 8 are genuine. So he said, "We need not hesitate to declare our conviction that the disputed words were not written by St. John, that they were originally brought into Latin copies in Africa from the margin, where they had been placed as a pious and orthodox gloss on verse 8, that from Latin they crept into 2 or 3 late Greek codices, and thence into the printed Greek text, a place to which they had no rightful claim." And so there's quite a lot there where he's saying that he knows that it came from the Latin copies. He knows that. He's not saying it's surmise or this is a theory. He's saying they were originally brought into the Latin copies in Africa from the margin. So, obviously talking about the whole thing with Cyprian and everything like that, which is interesting because he sort of defends Cyprian later, where they had been placed as a pious and orthodox gloss on verse 8. So I just can't see this commentary on verse 8 that ends up a Trinitarian thing. And what's amazing is, I think it was Gregory of Nazianzus. He pointed out that there was a grammatical issue. But when you have, 1 John 5, 7 and 8, when you have the comma removed, you have grammatical issues there. But amazingly, this gloss that came from Latin, if you squeeze that in there, all the grammatical issues go away. How does that happen? It's almost like a miracle. And someone like Scrivener, I've gone through enough of his Greek material to know that he doesn't, he has issues with his Greek. He would be the type of person who would say, "Oh, the word, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. It should be plural because it's Hashemayim. It's got the I am on the just this type of real basic type of understanding of language. I know he's a bit further down the road than that, but I don't think he was ever fluent in Greek. When you read things like he's changing rabdon to rabdos, and he's not even considering the context of what Jesus is saying. It's like, is this guy reading the Greek or is he just looking in dictionaries? And I think that's what he's doing. A lot of his changes are lexical. They're possible in a lexicon, but they're impossible in context. People who read languages in context are usually fluent. People who can't, they rely on the lexicon, they rely on a strict definition. So that's where some of his mistakes lie. So, so we have this gloss over verse 8, and from Latin they crept into 2 or 3 late Greek codices, and then were printed in the Greek text. Nothing about the works of Eugenius Vulgaris, who, in 1780, in another video I said it was 1880, which is a bit embarrassing, But 1780, he said that um, that there is a solecism there if the comma's not in there. And this was the reasoning behind having the Comma Johanneum in the 1904 Greek Bible. 1904 Greek Bible, published by the Orthodox Church, they admitted that they didn't do it because there's a strong representation of Greek um, manuscripts that have the verse. They did it on grammatical grounds, and that's one of the reasons why I contacted Georgios Babiniotis and said, was Eugenius Vulgaris correct to say there's a solecism here? And he said yes, absolutely. He agreed with him, and so, but Scrivener doesn't go into that. I don't think he could go into that. Scrivener estimated that 49 out of 50 of the Latin Vulgate manuscripts testify to this disputed comma. So that's in the plain introduction, 1894. So I think he died like in 1890 or something, but a lot of his material after he died was printed and edited by Miller. So that's why I sometimes bring Miller into the picture of, Scrivener, Burgon, Miller, and Hoskia sort of created the majority text movement. And so what later became the majority text, it was sort of, these are the puppy feet of that. Scrivener said, on the whole, therefore, we need not hesitate to declare our conviction that the disputed words were not written by St. John. Actually, that's exactly the same quote that I've got above. How embarrassing. Or is it? On the whole, they have no rightful claim. Yeah, it's the same word. It just starts differently. On a whole. Yeah. So that's something I need to delete. Philip Schaff said of Scrivener, he gives up the spurious interpolation of three witnesses as hopelessly untenable. And on the disputed reading of 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16, where his friend Dean Burgon so strenuously insists on theos, Scrivener in his lectures on page 192 makes the following admission. On the whole, if codices A and C be kept out of sight, we know not how more light can be thrown on their testimony. This is one of the controversies which the discovery of Codex Aleph ought to have closed, since it adds a first-rate unctual witness to a case already very strong through the support of versions. Slowly and deliberately, yet in full confidence that God, in other passages of his written word, has sufficiently assured us of the proper divinity of his incarnate Son. We have yielded up this cause as no longer tenable against the accumulated force of external evidence which has been brought against it. Okay, so he is absolutely rejecting 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16, which Dean Burgon agreed to. So this is the thing, many people are like, oh, Scrivener and Burgon, and I used to sort of play with that idea, like maybe Scrivener and Burgon maybe Scrivener, after he did his text, that was the text that Burgon wanted to make, but when you look at what Burgon wanted to make, he did, 14 chapters of Matthew, and he had, I think it was like 130 differences that he wanted to make. I actually forget the number, but there was quite a lot of differences just in 14 chapters. And Burgon in the end was basically just saying, I'm not a TR advocate. I'm not advocating for the Textus Receptus. And he was advocating for what he called the traditional text. And so his traditional text, because I believe that he, grew up in the Greek Orthodox type of environment, I believe he thought that they had the correct text. And so, okay, plain introduction, 1861. So this is number 24. So this would be the 24th place where there's an issue for Scrivener. 1 John 5:7, and I won't read it to you in the Greek, but you can see there in the brackets where it has Hopata, Hologos, Kaiho, Agion, Pneuma, Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit. And so then the brackets end up here at gay. The authenticity of the words within brackets will perhaps no longer be maintained by anyone whose judgment ought to have weight. But this result has been arrived at after a long and memorable controversy, which helped to keep alive, especially in England, some interest in biblical studies, and led to investigations into collateral points of the highest importance, such as the sources of the received text, the manuscripts employed by Robert Stephanus or Stevens, the origin and value of Velician readings, and so on. A critical resume of the whole discussion might be profitably undertaken by some competent scholar. We can at present touch only on the chief heads of the great debate. 2 verses appear in the early editions, adopting again the notation employed above on page 301, with the following notable variations in the common text. Verse 7, N to oranu, and then he's got, it looks like he's got some Latin there, so I won't attempt to read that whole entire section. If you want to, just go for it. But I'm not sure if it's actually just Latin or if it's they're trying, USQUE, and yeah, it looks like Latin. Yeah. So, and then it's got his way of sort of saying non-C, Erasmus's 4th and 5th edition, So he's got it all like in code there, so that's pretty hard to read. They are found, including the clause "entu oranu ente gay," in no more than 3 manuscripts of very late date. One of the Codex Ravenus, being a mere worthless copy from printed books, and in the margin of a 4th, in the hand as late as the 16th century. The real witnesses are Codex Montfortianus, number 61, whose history was described above, and for the margin, a Naples manuscript. On comparing these slight and scanty authorities within the received text, we find they present the following variations, and I actually haven't finished putting that in. How embarrassing. I was copying that. Okay. Following variations. So it should be there. Okay, so basically he's got a whole section on it. And it is quite complex, as you can see. I'll enlarge on it. I actually thought that it was just a closed quote, so sorry about that. Talks about the Complutensian. He's basically talking about his understanding of the whole situation. And most of the time he's just looking in Greek, okay? And that's not really an issue for the TR KJV people. We understand that for some people it has to do with having a plethora of Greek. We know that even critical text guys, most of the time, their readings are very scanty in Greek. So if we're going to say, okay, well, this is doubted because there's not that much Greek. Okay, well then if we take that logic, all the critical text is doubted. It's sort of like, what about the closed class of witnesses? What about the early church writings? What about the Latin? 95% of the Latin So that would count them as a majority. And the thing is, these guys in 1 Timothy chapter 3 verse 16, the vast majority of Greek back up the word theos. But in the Latin, it's lacking because it's quite easy to make a mistake there. And I'm pretty sure it was to do with mistaking it as a definite article, the os. And so it sort of turned into he appeared in a body. And so that crept into a few Greek manuscripts, And so, but the vast majority are, say theos. But they go with the Latin there and say, oh, the Latin's lacking it, so we're going to have to change it to he appeared in the body. And it's like, but really, at the end of the day, it's to do with Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. But so these guys aren't interested in the majority. The critical text guys are not interested in what the majority text says. If they were, they would keep the last 12 verses of Mark. Only 2 manuscripts differ. The rest of them have the last 12 verses, and it's like, why all of a sudden are you interested in the majority text here in 1 John 5:7? And why are you ignoring the grammatical argumentation that just keeps getting brought up? So anyway, that was a little bit of a confusing sort of detour there. So I'll just move on rather than harp on about how I should be doing better. Cyprian. Scrivener allowed for the authenticity of the Cyprian citation as a reference to the verse being in Cyprian's Bible. To allow for this, Scrivener's theory of the source and timing of an interpolation cannot be late, and his scenario did not give estimated dates or any names responsible. So Scrivener said the disputed words were originally brought to Latin from Africa, from the margin, where they had been placed as pious and an orthodox gloss. I think that's the 3rd time I've actually quoted that one. And so Scrivener estimated that 49 out of 50 Vulgate manuscripts testified to the disputed comma. So it's roughly 95% of the Latin manuscripts apparently have the comma. In one of the most ancient, it contained CAV, I'm not sure what that is, verse 8 precedes verse 7, as appears also in M. Toll Demid and Codex Wolfenbüttel, Wizenbang 99, cited by Luckman, while in the margin it is written Audiac hac Arius et Ceteri, go the Latin, as if its authenticity was questioned. And so, yeah, Scrivener was, he would say, okay, 49 out of 50 Vulgate manuscripts have the comma. And so, but then just basically focuses on the Greek. He doesn't go into the grammatical arguments. And I think that's the modus operandi with most critical text guys. Critical text guys, they're like, oh, it's slim in the Greek, in the Textus Receptus. Let's not bring up anything else. Let's not bring up grammatical issues. Let's not bring up the Latin. Let's not bring up the early church writers. Whatever is like, if they have a limp, let's just focus on that limp, nothing else. If they have a bit of a hole in their case, we only focus on that hole. Not that there can be internal evidence that could help, or grammatical issues, or that early church writing. It's so I started going through the early church writings when I was building my website, and there's so much early church writing to do with the comma that it just shocks me, and the amount of stuff just coming up all the time, and these gurus are just like, oh, it wasn't mentioned, and Cyprian didn't mention it, this other guy didn't mention it, and then you're like, oh, hang on, Origin clearly sort of mentions it there, and you start going through, and it's like, by the 4th century, this is just everywhere being quoted, and it's like, how can you deny that? I mean, if they're going to say Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are reliable because they're that old, and then you've got all these quotations that are that old. It's like, why aren't you believing those quotations? It's just they're just cherry picking the information they want. They're putting away information that comes against their position. They just don't touch it. They don't even acknowledge that it exists. It's like going to a smorgasbord and there's a seafood section there, and you just like just walk past it. So it doesn't exist. We don't want to go there, and they just don't. We want to have a battle on the grammar issue, and I know Hofstadter, he sort of did this before the Georgios Babiniotis issue, but there's been a lot of holes poked in his argumentation, but people don't want to go even talk about the grammar, and that's been one of the main things throughout history. It's sort of like, um, if you were going to debate against someone who's a flat earther, you find out why they believe in flat Earth, so then you can debunk it. These guys don't even want to find out about that. If they think that we're so strange and we're just adding the comma for tradition, and because we're Trinitarian, and if you take that out, you take the Trinity out, and these stupid arguments. It's like, no, we think you can still get the Trinity in the Bible. It's all the way through the Bible, but it's probably one of the strongest verses for the Trinity. Doesn't mean you're taking the whole thing out, but it does regulate God to three. These three are one. I mean, it's probably the only place that says that. The whole Michael Heiser thing of the being two, that's just like, oh no, this guy Heiser, he's just twisting and turning everything. So anyway, back to Scrivener. The Cambridge Paragraph Bible, the 1873 Cambridge Paragraph Bible, which is found in the New Testament Octapla, and which is the base text of the Zondervan KJV Study Bible, which I've got actually somewhere there, and many other recent KJVs, throws the words in question into italics. This is reflected in the detail below from the original Cambridge Paragraph Bible of 1873 by the New Testament Octapla's reproduction of Scrivener's Cambridge Paragraph Bible, and by Scrivener's book, the Authorized Edition on the English Bible, and its subsequent reprints and modern representatives. Now, for any King James person, TR person, I recommend you read books like that. Go through, look at what Scrivener believed, look at what he thought. Some of what he says is interesting. Some of what he says is just sort of like, oh, sounds like Westcott and Hort saying it. So if you're reading through it, it's sort of like, it's a bit like reading through James Snapp's material. Some of it's favourable, some of it's not, and in the end you realise that this guy's he's not a pro King James guy. Okay, so I'll just show you the picture of the Cambridge Paragraph Bible. So we can see here, there are three that bear record, and then the italics start. In heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these three are one. And there are three that bear witness on earth, and then the italics stop, the Spirit, the water, and the blood. And so that's what Scrivener wanted in the Paragraph Bible. So that shows you his doubts on this verse. He didn't like the verse. So that book, the Authorized Edition and the English Bible, it verifies that this was a deliberate change that Scrivener made on his own authority. The portion of 1 John chapter 5 verse 7 and 8, which is now for the first time set in italics in the Cambridge Paragraph Bible, is probably no longer regarded as genuine by anyone who is capable of forming an independent judgment on the state of the evidence. So, if you're capable of forming an independent judgment on this, you would probably not see it as genuine. So that's what he's saying. The Zondervan reprints, however, silently reverse Scrivener's decision to put the words back into regular type. The prefaces to these reprints give no indication regarding this change, although other changes regarding spelling are acknowledged. Scrivener was commissioned by the Revised Version Committee to make an accurate edition of the Greek text underlying the King James Version. This was made to show people exactly where the New Greek text departed from the historic Textus Receptus that underlay the KJV. To date, this is the most accurate of modern editions of the Textus Receptus, although some minor modified editions do exist, like say even this one of J. Green's, I think it's just 1996. Like he puts the final amen in Ephesians there because the 1611 didn't have it. They say it was probably a print error, but then there was the Clementine Vulgate that didn't have it either. But what I'm discovering is sometimes this actually confused printers when you, if you look through the video, I just did a Brian Ross and Jude 125, that the word both, which is translated from key, the key was actually missing in Theodore Beza's edition, but it was a print error because his Latin has it, and there's no footnote saying that it shouldn't be there, and it's in all the other early editions. But then when I actually checked Erasmus, it wasn't there. That's why it's not in some of the earlier English Bibles. And so what happened was the 1602 Bodleian one that they were supposed to follow, the Bishop's Bible, that didn't have both there, probably following the Erasmus. And then you find the 1598 of Beza didn't have the chi there, which means both, because of a print error. So the printers are like, oh, both of these main things that we're supposed to follow don't have it. Must be an error, and so that they've left it out, and they left out both. So that was put back in 1638. Just to let you know that, yeah, sometimes these print errors can go back, you know, and it would have been hard in those days to be a printer. Some misinformed people think that Scrivener worked on the TR edition. Sorry, it should say and, or as was at times against some of the changes in the revised Greek text, that he was a TR advocate, but this is false. Okay, so this is what he has in the TR, so he has that. So I've entitled this, Scrivener Part 1, because as you can see, there's a few little bits and pieces on this article where I've doubled up the same quote 3 times, which is kind of embarrassing. But one of the times here, when it's talking about Cyprian, that quote there, he actually, I don't know why that got changed, because I remember reading it from this exact article. I must have reverted it back or just saved it the wrong way or whatever. But there is I'm going to type it in. Scrivener SIP usual explaining away. Yeah, here we are. So this is the quotation. Oh, it's on my site. Yeah, Cyprian. It's actually, because I've done one on Cyprian. So, yeah, here. This is the quote, what the quote should say. Surely safer and more candid to admit that Cyprian read verse 7 in his copies than to resort to the explanation of Facundus that the holy bishop was merely putting upon verse 8 a spiritual meaning. Arthur Cleveland Cox referenced Scrivener and said, "It is surely safer and more candid to admit that Cyprian read it in his copies than to resort to, etc., the usual explainings away." So this is one of the things that people are saying, well, Scrivener did accept that Cyprian probably read that in his Bible. So that's the quotation that I should have on the other page. So sorry about that, but I eventually got there. I'm just going to check and see if anyone's chatting. Okay, we've got quite a bit of banter here. Um, so Hudson says, did Erasmus know about the grammar issue without 1 John 5:7, and did he follow any of the Latin readings as reference to support particular scripture verses? I think he would have favoured Latin readings. There's the three closed class of witnesses. You got the Latin, you got the early church writers, and you got the Greek. But he definitely left it out of his first two editions because it was lacking in the Greek. So he was faithful to not just follow the Latin. And that's the thing when people talk about in Revelation, oh, he just followed one manuscript. They just go against everything Erasmus wrote in his annotations, and just go against history. And they say, oh, he only had one manuscript. It was a Reuchlins Codex, and then so anything that departs from the Reuchlins Codex, oh, he must have got it from the Vulgate. But it goes against. See, Erasmus was totally against um, like back translating from the Vulgate. Usually, when I say Erasmus got readings from the Vulgate, it's like he got the ideas, he got the concepts. It's there. It's historically valid. And in the Greek, it's sort of lacking. But that's where he can identify things like homoioteliton, and that's how he is getting some of that internal understanding. So when, say, in Revelation chapter 22, verse 19, where it has the book of life, and he said in some of his manuscripts, which proves that he didn't have one, in his manuscripts, he realized it was homoioteliton. So it's a similar endings or similar way that words look, or it's part of parablepsis, which is just an overlooking. And so I there, some people are like, oh, he got this from the Latin, got that from the Latin. I just don't think that we have everything that Erasmus used. If you ask the gurus today, Dan Wallace will say, oh, Erasmus had about five manuscripts, and that is what the King James is based on. So the King James is based on five manuscripts, late manuscripts. And it's like, what? So then you talk to James White, and he's like, oh, between 6 and 12 manuscripts. And then, because I started going through and whenever people bring up how many manuscripts of Erasmus, and it was quite funny. I could make one of those videos, where it's just one after the other. And Stephen Boyce was a classic because I think he said between 6 and 12, and then he said like between 8 and 11 or something the next day. It was just the very next day, and I was like, where's he getting these numbers? Just pulling them out of thin air. And then James White said, oh, I doubt Erasmus would have had more than 20. And so we've gone from 5 to 6 to 12 to 20. And when you look at Erasmus, the more you study Erasmus, the more you realize he was surrounded by manuscripts. Like, absolutely. So, see, the thing is, then it becomes like, oh no, they're the number of manuscripts that he had in his hand when he was at Basel. And it's like, oh, okay, so if he's examined like 40 manuscripts in a museum in like a day, you've gone through, or in a week or something, it isn't that 40 manuscripts that he's looked at. He's just written down variants. So, oh, that's different. That's different. Okay, that's the same. And he's just written it down. He mightn't be able to keep that. So this is the strange thing. It's almost like the standards for Westcott Hort were they just basically had to have facsimiles and copies of Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. They didn't have to own them, but Erasmus sort of had to own them. Like he couldn't just go to a library and look at something. I mean, sometimes a library are like, no, this is too valuable, you can't take it. And so he was copying all the time, writing out, um, different words. And so, anyway, I'll keep reading through this. When he's examined by Dr. F.H.A. Scrivener, Codex Aleph Sinaiticus was declared to be roughly written and full of gross transcriptural blunders, such as leaving out whole lines of the original. Yeah, it's quite amazing. And yeah, these manuscripts were they were barfed on by scholars of the day. Um, when you look at Burgon's critique of these manuscripts of Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, they're just like, these are just disgusting manuscripts. And so Scrivener, he collated Sinaiticus, And I think the thing is, he did that. He did quite a lot of very interesting things, but in his heart, he was critical text. That's the problem. I think he actually did more to further the cause of Westcott and Hort than anyone else besides Westcott and Hort of that era. I know you've got guys like Schaff and Lightfoot and Wordsworth and other guys of that era. But when you look at Scrivener, because he is he's sort of like pseudo TR, pseudo KJV sort of thing. He's focusing on KJV issues. But when you go through it, it's like, even in his Cambridge Paragraph Bible, where he has strain, excuse me, strain at a gnat, or he has strain out a gnat. And he said, oh, that's the correct reading. And I remember even Peter Gurry pulled me up on that, and he said, oh, he was saying something. I said, look, you're straining out a gnat. And he said, I'm not. And he said, and actually, that scripture that you quoted is wrong in the King James. Should be straining out a gnat. And I said, well, that's a side issue, but you're wrong. It should be strain out a gnat. And so I started actually quoting. So I thought I might have something on my website, and I just had a link to James Snap's material. So he's basically on the same page as me and Will Kitty and a bunch of other guys on that. And so I got James Snap's material, and I just started copying and pasting direct quotes from James Snap's article to Peter Curry, and he's like, "No, no, not listening. No, that's just stupid," and just basically just writing it off. It's just like, what would this King James only hillbilly guy on the veranda playing his banjo guy know? So anyway, James Snap jumped on there and said, "I'm sorry, Peter, but Nick's correct. It is strain Adenat." And he's like, "Oh, what do you mean? How do you prove that?" And he's like, and so he showed um, his article, and so he would have read through the article and seen that I posted probably about 4 or 5 things from that article. He's like, "Oh, yeah, no, you're correct," but he listened to him. So if you doubt the TR and you doubt the King James version, and what position does James Snap have? He's in the middle of nowhere. Who's the Greek that he's compiled, which I've gone through. He's it's got lots of errors in it. Um, there's no Bibles based on it. Where are the Bibles based upon his text? Where's the historical lineage for his text? It's just sort of in the middle of nowhere, but he's still respected because he's not King James. Yeah, and Peter Gurry will just go, "Oh, James Snap's here," but if I'm there and I say something, it's just like, "Oh, whatever, you banjo player." It's just bias. So but yeah, that's a reading of Scrivener's in his paragraph Bible. He changes that. So it just shows you the level of scholarship that Scrivener had. I don't think he was that great. I think he was a plotter, and he probably had a few guys working around him. A lot of these guys back in those days, it was sort of like Tregelles and a few other guys that they were trying really hard to make a name for themselves in that industry, and so um, Vladimir said, I poked Brian Ross to consider covering the rise of Unitarian in the UK and US during the 18th century, and thus the subsequent uh, necessity for discovery of Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. He's already working on it. That's really good. And one of the guys who actually points out that quite a lot, or has a lot of quotations on that on his website, is David Cloud. So David Cloud, even in his book, um, in his book, we've got like good books like Evangelicals in Rome, um, Rome and the Bible, um, and a whole bunch of others. But he has a good little one. You can download it as a PDF on his website called Unholy Hands on the Bible. And he just goes through some of the testimonies of Bible translators and people who have worked on the Bible, on the text and things like that. But yeah, he has whole articles on just the Unitarian influence on the Bible and just quotations and things like that, because it's quite astounding to when you read. I think it's Caspar Rene Gregory. Is it him or von Soden? I can't remember whether it's. I think it might be von Soden. Is a Unitarian. Um, it just gets to the point where you start going through a lot of these names in like Unitarian, Unitarian, Unitarian. It's like half of these guys in the academy back then are Unitarians. Bible Society, the Trinitarians had left because so many Unitarians had joined, and it was just flooding England at the time and the UK. Sorry, and the US. So yeah, really good topic. So Vladimir says, I think Erasmus, back translated from the KJV, had no manuscripts. Uh, Erasmus back translated from the KJV. Yeah, that I mean, who knows? That will become like the joke next. The thing is, well, if the King James version is good enough for Paul, it's good enough for me. And it's like, oh, sorry, was that a joke? It's like, but the thing is, when you go through it, if you were just to translate absolutely everything into English, Paul did use the Masoretic text that underlies the King James version um, in his quotations and things like that. Yes, at times he paraphrased, at times he mixed things together, at times he summarized, but he is quoting the Masoretic text. I mean, the whole thing about the LXX, I mean, how easy is it just to copy and paste from the New Testament into the Old Testament, the same language? Just go, okay, well, there's Psalm 22. Let's just copy, this section of what Jesus said and just throw it into there. And now it fits, but it just sort of ruins a bunch of other words in the meanwhile. And it's like we can see where they've done it there. We can see where the LXX has been amended by the New Testament. So that's quite interesting. So I think we've sort of covered everything we need to cover, especially just for a part one of Scrivener. I'll amend those quotes on my website. Just a quick thing for those interested. I've just been going through. I'll just look at my contribs. If you want to see what I'm working on, you can usually go to my contributions up here. Or down the other side, there is like recent changes. There's quite a lot on my website if you go there. You can go random page. It's quite interesting. End up somewhere. So you can see what I've been working on. But if we go to Proverbs 26:23, the silver dross or glaze, what I've realized in reading that article the other day, the whole entire issue is to do with the word potsherd. That's what it's come down to. I actually had like an earthen vessel covered with silver dross, and that was the issue. A pot's, or it should be pronounced like pot sherd, potsherd. And so anyway, I went through that. I had the Oxford English Dictionary just going through it. Um, Basically, it's a potsherd is a broken pot. From pot and sherd, a pot, a container, a vessel, earthenware vessel, and then we have sherd, a piece of fire clay or broken earthenware. So it's basically a pot that's been broken, a fragment of a earthenware pot would be a synonym. And so, yes, I've gone through and put some of the Oxford things in there, Webster's, and then looking at silver gloss or a glaze. So the thing is, what's actually happened is the Ugaritic um, has the Hebrew word for potsherd, which is um, 02789. I think I put it in there. Here we go. Caress. It appears 8 times. And so, yeah, the earthen vessel, earthen vessel, earthen vessel, earthen vessel. And so I just put all this in yesterday. But so basically, a potsherd is like a shattered piece of pottery. And so you've got this broken piece of pottery, you're putting silver dross on it. So it's like the waste of silver. And it was interesting. I think it was Vladimir. He was. You were talking on um, my Facebook last night. I sort of got a glimpse of that. I haven't got it on here, but yeah, talking about the different temperatures and things like that. But basically, what I'm trying to say is the word potsherd is the one that the Ugaritic is translated differently as. So it's sort of like saying a potsherd is just instead of a broken pot or a fragment of a pot, it's actually um, like a good pot, earthenware. So then they change burning lips sort of like into smooth lips, but some of them have burning lips. Burning lips and wicked heart are like a pot, a very nice pot, covered with silver dross. And it's like, why would you put silver dross over a nice pot? Um, or we have to change that to a glaze. And so they've actually changed the silver dross part because of the Ugaritic's um, definition of potsherd, which in the article that I read through yesterday, it seems like basically a silver dross and a glaze can be very similar. And so, yeah, that's a whole another issue. But yeah, I just sort of point out that it's sort of like this has triggered a change here. The thing is the potsherd. So that's what I'm going through. I'm just getting the basics down, learning what it is in the Oxford. Obviously Mark Ward would be shocked at a King James only blue alien blood secondary inspiration, Ruckmanite fanboy, is reading the Oxford English Dictionary. It's like, oh my God, can he actually read that thing? Um, yeah, so we've got the Oxford there. So I'm going through all these and just making sure that I understand the English first, and then yeah, going through the Hebrew, going through the different verses. So I just sort of mentioned that's a bit of a carry on from the video that I did, part 4 of an examination of the debate between myself and Rob Rowe. I found it interesting that James White's had a really, he's basically harping on about David Pullman. And David Pullman, he's an interesting guy. He's sort of talks about philosophy a lot, which to me it's just highfalutin language, sort of gets nowhere. He's talking about presuppositionalism, evidentialism, and a whole bunch of material that's sort of way above my head, but I wouldn't mind understanding it. I don't want to be cornered and left out, in a sense where um, I know it's boring, but sometimes you've got to at least know the basics of something, that Christians are going on about. So if you go to say Dave Pullman's Facebook or his YouTube and just watch one of his videos, you'll get what I'm saying. He'll talk in highfalutin language, but he's not doing that on purpose. It's just to get into that arena, you have to know that sort of highfalutin stuff, and to me it's boring as, but it can affect things. But I found it interesting that James White went through one of his recent debates and basically said, well, this guy works at Dillard's. So Dillard's must be like I think it's a furniture store or something like that in the US. I don't know really what it is, but it's just like a shop. And he's just sort of like works on the floor there as a salesman or something like that. But because he works at Dillard's, that sort of made him totally unqualified in the name in the eyes of James White, and so he can't do any scholarship. Who is this young guy who works at Dillard's? And people were sort of grilling James White a bit, like, well, that shouldn't really matter, because I mean, how many students really, while they do their PhD, heaps. There's people who have really who are in the academy, and they haven't been mummy and daddy's boys. They've actually climbed through a bit of garbage to get this education, to get their qualifications, and to get where they're at. They've fought hard to do it. And on the critical text side, and I just felt that looking at David Palmer, why should it matter that he works at Dillard's? I mean, isn't that one of the things that James White always pushes for? We wish that the layman would know all this stuff. We're bringing this information so that you can understand this sort of stuff. And so it's an interesting thing to follow anyway. If you jump on David Palmer's Facebook and have a look at that, you can sort of follow through, and people are making lots of memes about it. There's a bunch of people doing YouTube videos just going through what's actually happened, and it's a bit of a storm in a teacup, but for me, it's quite interesting because David was the one who got me to debate Stephen Boyce, and I guess in a way he saw Stephen Boyce as like the latest upcoming guy who's coming against the King James, and in a way I feel sort of privileged that he felt that I was like a worthy enough opponent to he must have seen a bit of my stuff, and he's like, oh, Nick Sayers is he knows a bit of stuff, and so let's do a debate on Revelation 16:5 or whatever. And it was good that they picked Revelation 16:5. That was my strong point, and woman caught in adultery was Boyce's strong point. And so, so sort of knowing him from back like a couple of years ago and seeing where he's gone to now, and then seeing him get totally like written off by James White, because I was like, one of the things that he said in a video, David Pullman said was, I actually don't mind James White's book, The King James Only Controversy. It really helped me to get out of King James Onlyism. He said that's like one of his most logical books. I can't understand why he doesn't apply the same logic to all his other books. And I was like, so I was pretty vocal about that on one thread. I was just like, man, the King James Only Controversy is probably one of his worst books. I haven't really gone through like books like The Potter's Freedom and things like that. I guess when I used to listen to a lot of Dave Hunt, and Dave Hunt really went right off James White because they used to work together and do stuff together. Then all of a sudden it was sort of like they were debating each other. Then all of a sudden, James White's basically saying that Dave Hunt's a King James only guy, when he really wasn't. He was a TR guy. But then he actually sort of gravitated towards a King James sort of position. And so anyway, I just sort of throw that in. I'll just check and see if there's any more live stuff here. You do superb work, Nick. Yeah, I wish I could do more. I really feel like this is one of my things where people love to go golfing. People love to surf. My boss, he loves to surf. He's a really good surfer, actually. So many good surfers here in Australia, especially in Byron Bay. But at the end of the day, I love doing this stuff. If I could have, if I could have a day off, it's like, man, I'm just in front of the computer, just studying, just doing stuff, and updating my website and doing all that sort of stuff, because I really do enjoy it, and I enjoy just understanding more. And the more that I look into the issues of the TR, the Textus Receptus, the more clarity seems to get there, and the more I seem to be able to see through the critical text garbage. It doesn't worry me anymore. I guess it never used to really worry me. It's more like it's just exhausting going through the amount of material that they bring out, and they just seem to have layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of just rubbish. So you start peeling it all back, and eventually it's like, no, it's rubbish. Like the Revelation 16:5 thing, it took a while, but it got there, and now I don't think James White just doesn't bring that up anymore. So I'm like, but that's just one thing. There's probably like 100 others, but I think we're really making quite a big impact in this generation. and it's good that people are sharing a lot of material around, um, and yeah, I'm really enjoying Brian Ross's material at the moment. Um, I guess some things I disagree with Brian Ross. I think he sometimes agrees with David Norton a little bit too much. I guess he's read those books, gone, wow, this is interesting. But I've got books like God's Secretaries and other books about King James and stuff. But yeah, I read them and go, probably like 70% of it's right, and the, the other stuff's just sort of put in there to sell a book or whatever. And you've always just got to go back to the original sources, and you can't just rely on an author just saying, well, this is the reason why King James was like this. It's like, no, that's his own opinion. We've got to be careful of adopting um, worldly opinions, and sometimes I do see that shining through with Brian stuff, but I'm trying to sort of keep him in check. And also the whole thing about, they just basically went to the Bodleian, 1602. It's like, cool, that's good. Uh, yeah, so that's the Bishop's Bible, 1602. That's great. It does say they did that, but it says they amended it with the Greek. So that's the text of Beza. So you can't leave that out of the equation. And so that's one of the things that I'm pushing for, is for Brian to sort of get more into that. And, maybe it might be one of those things where, because I'm watching every one of them now, where I started to go through from the beginning of his series, and it's sort of like, okay, and I skipped a few and got to the Reformation. But his stuff is pretty good. And I know that, he's putting in a lot of effort to do these videos. And so I don't want to just be down on him. I guess, when people talk about this issue, because it is a hot button topic, we tend to be a little bit more critical, and we're looking at what Brian's doing and going, hang on, you might have said 10 correct things, but the last thing you just said is definitely wrong. But the thing is, he's just said 10 correct things. And so his whole video series is like a really good base for someone just to go through from beginning to end and just educate themselves on these issues. And um, I guess just having a few, doing that, but having a few chases of like, a little bit of study for themselves, or maybe a few looking at the comments in YouTube and things like that would help. Anyway, I'm going to bail, guys. God bless you. Thanks for joining us. I'll probably jump back into the Rob's or the question and answers period. Actually, it's Rob's rebuttal. That's where we're up to. And so that'll be part 5 of examining the King James only debate between me and Rob Rowe. God bless you guys. Thanks for joining us. Peace.